Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Modern Brewer podcast. So everyone who works in a brewery will be familiar with brewery suppliers. Whilst it may seem like we have quite a lot, in fact we really don't. There's only really 4 to 6 major suppliers in each of our main ingredients. What I love about brewery suppliers is instead of being hyper price driven and sales focused in a way, they're actually really customer service focused. I'm sure there's brewers owners out there scoffing at that point, but hear me out. Working in or running a brewery requires considerably deep knowledge about a broad range of subject matter, and without the standard level of qualification or one that sufficiently covers both theoretical and practical, it often leads to inevitable gaps in knowledge and experience. The smaller the team, the more likely this gap is to exist. On top of this, we all know how important cost control and regular supply of essential goods are to maintaining a brewery's existence. I hope this isn't sounding all too doom and gloom, and if it is, well, I have good news for you. My guest this week might have the answer to these problems. Before we introduce him, a quick request from myself. So far, I've received some incredibly heartwarming feedback and constructive feedback, which is also great, as it really helps me continue the podcast on. But what would be super interesting is if anyone was to get in contact with subjects they would like to cover in the podcast. What do you think makes great brewers? If you have an answer to this, please get in touch via LinkedIn or email me at chris@brewresourceful.com. Okay, let's find out if our guest this week has the answer to all our problems. So with me today is Andrew Patteson. He started his career at Brewdog in Fraserburgh, then went on to become the head brewer of the legendary Dark Star Brewing, and then in 2018 made the switch to the supplier side of the industry as Lallamand's technical sales manager for the UK and Scandinavia. Welcome to the show, Andrew Patteson.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah, awesome, man. I really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy, and I mean, most people listening to this will probably already know who you are. I know you're quite active around the brewing scene, which is awesome. But if you could just start off by just taking us through a more detailed journey of your career.
Yeah, of course. So I actually studied biochemistry at the University of Edinburgh, starting 2006 and graduating in 2010. And at that point in time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, which I think is probably fairly common when you come to the end of a university degree. And I had several people within the family, I actually have a Scottish background, who suggested looking at the distilling industry. And that fascinated me. You know, I'd worked in the university bar, I liked beer, I liked whiskey, and I thought, well, maybe this is something I could go for. And it has to be said, with a great deal of scepticism from my tutors at Edinburgh University, I started looking at the master's course at Heriot-Watt. Edinburgh University would have tended to push me towards pharmaceuticals research, banking, insurance, that sort of thing, the kind of things that you would do with an Edinburgh university degree. But it wasn't the sort of thing that I was particularly interested in. I wanted to do something that was practical, something that was applied. So I went for the master's course at Heriot-Watt. And I have to say, it was probably the best decision I've made in my life. It was absolutely brilliant. I was there for a year. In that year, I met people from all over Europe and the United States and Canada and Thailand, and we were a very close-knit group. So I made friends for life there, and I still go on holiday with a core group of 5 to 6 of them that will work in the brewing industry still every year.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I had an absolutely great time. Coming to the end of that, I obviously wanted to work in brewing or distilling. But I sort of came to the realisation that if I were to work in distilling forever, I would maroon myself in slightly sparsely populated parts of Scotland. And despite having some Scottish family, the majority of my friends and family are in the West Country. And I thought it would be prudent to do something that wasn't just distilling. So I started looking around at brewing jobs, and quite quickly got in contact with Brewdog, actually via a friend of mine who's Canadian, who also managed to get a job there. So I travelled up to Fraserburgh, I think it was maybe May 2011, and did a couple of trial shifts, which were absolutely brutal, I have to say. It was in at the deep end. This wasn't an automated piece of brewing equipment by any stretch of the imagination. You were mashing in a 40-barrel mash tun with a spade in the middle of the night, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, more or less. But it was good fun. Again, we had at that time, they had people from all over the world working there. So I had a good friend who remains a friend to this day, although I don't see him very much, who has a little brew pub in Panama. There were people from Australia, from New Zealand. It was a fun place to work, but it was, again, quite remote. And my girlfriend at the time, now wife, issued a bit of a diktat and said to me, I'm working in Bristol, you're working north of Aberdeen, this isn't really going to work unless you look to do something else. So I started looking for jobs just in the south, not anywhere in particular. I think I had an offer from Bristol Beer Factory, and then I got in contact with Darkstar, and they had a position coming up. And my wife actually got a job in Sussex as well, so we met over in Brighton, and we spent a few years living in Brighton, and then moved to the school that she taught at and lived there for the next 5, I think. And at that time I worked at Darkstar, and started off just as a brewer, made my way up to head brewer. Saw the production increase from, I think we were doing about 15,000 hectolitres up to about 25,000 hectolitres with about 7 people. It was quite intense. Yeah. Installed a lab. It was fun. I quite enjoyed it. We certainly made some great beers, and I think we made quite a big difference to the quality of the beer that was coming out, particularly towards the latter years of my time there. And then I got to the point in 2018 where I'd been there 6 years, and I fancied a bit of a change. There was probably a limit on how much investment was going to be put into Darkstar at that stage. I don't think there was going to be much further investment, so there was limits with what I could do to change things. So I fancied a change, and I started to look around at supplier jobs. Initially, I was looking at supplier jobs because we lived at my wife's a school that she worked at, and we lived there rent-free. So I didn't really want to move to a different brewery because I was like, I've got this massive benefit in not having to pay accommodation because of my wife's job. So I was like, what can I do that's in the brewing industry that doesn't involve moving to another brewery? And the answer was supply, and it wasn't something I'd really considered prior to that point. But once I'd considered it, I was like, actually, that sounds like a really good idea. And I deposited my CV with Carling Partnership. I don't know if you know those guys, but they do drinks industry specific recruitment. And I had a couple interviews through them. I think one with the maltings, which I don't think I was a good fit for. I didn't really like them, they didn't really like me. And then eventually along came an opportunity to join Lallemand. So I met with my colleague, now Robert Percival. You may have met, I don't know.
Yes.
He covers, I think, global sales for Lallemand now. Met with him in Waitrose Cafe in Haywards Heath, and we had an interview there. And it was quite a long process. I think about 6 months later, I actually signed on the dotted line. Joined Lallemand in January of 2018. My first day was a day off because it was the 1st of January, which I was very pleased about. And I haven't really looked back since then. It's a very interesting company to work for. Brewing's about 2% of what Lallemand does, and they have lots of fingers in lots of interesting pies, all to do with the growth and sale of bacteria, yeast, in various sectors. And you meet people from all these different sectors, and it's just fascinating. I really get off on the kind of different things that we do. I just love it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot of people who listen, or I speak to in the brewing industry, who often want to make that switch from the brewing industry to like the production industry of brewing to the supplier side. How did you find that switch? Did you miss brewing a lot? Was there aspects that you were really happy to leave behind? How was that switch?
Yeah, I think there actually were aspects that I was happy to leave behind. I think, when you're working in a microbrewery, often in a small team, you can quite easily end up burning out a bit just because the work is so physical, and actually the hours are very long as well. And I think in many respects that's probably a young man's game. And I think it depends on the brewery that you work in. As they get bigger and they get more structured, there's probably less of that. But Darkstar especially was, it was an annual job. You were doing everything, and the hours were very long. And I certainly enjoyed not having to do that anymore. Having said that, moving to a sales role from a deeply practical production role was completely alien at first. When you're in sales, you spend a lot of your time planning the weeks ahead, working out where you're going to visit, responding to people, that sort of thing. But it can actually mean that there's quite a lot of downtime. So you might, especially in the early days when you don't have a lot of interaction back and forth or responding to inquiries because you haven't been out in the market that long, you can have a lot of time where you don't really know what to do with yourself. And I think it's probably a mark of being a reasonably good employee that you feel a bit guilty about that. So you're like, what am I doing? Why why am I here? Am I doing enough? And I think, I've spoken to other people that have entered the supply world and they feel like that as well. It depends on the kind of supply that you join as well. And we work through distributors, so the actual sales directly to breweries are limited. So in that regard, when I'm directly interacting with brewers, it's more technical support than it is sales. So you don't have that day-to-day back and forth with breweries. So it probably means that the Lallemand structure, it lends itself even more to those periods of downtime when you first start. So yeah, it was quite weird. And I guess at times it could be quite lonely because you're driving around and you're staying in a place that you don't know particularly, in a hotel. So you sort of, it definitely takes a bit of getting used to, but once you're used to it and you understand how it works, it becomes a lot easier to live with. I'm quite disciplined as well, so I think, because you're working from home most of the time, you're not in an office. There's a temptation for some might be to start looking at the TV or procrastinating, reading things on the internet, and certainly I'm not immune to that sort of thing. I would never turn on the TV during the day. I try my hardest not to procrastinate. You need quite a lot of self-discipline.
Yeah, completely. I can relate maybe slightly to that. As I moved out of the production side to start Brew Resourceful, a lot of it is computer based, and then I'm out and about, kind of like you are, I guess. But I certainly miss like the production environment. It's like there's always something to be doing. There's never really a time to take your foot off, which really helps again with that lack of procrastination, because you just always have things to do, and there's always people around you. I always think it was like really good crack in all the breweries I worked in. It was really fun, and I do really miss that side of it where it's like team mentality. And like, I mean, there is obviously still teams within Lallemand, etc., but like the day-to-day being there, knowing people, like seeing people more than you see like your partner is like, or like your best friends, is kind of crazy. But I always kind of miss that like level of camaraderie when I sort of moved out of the production side.
I would agree. I mean, we're pretty tight within Lallemand with regard to kind of communicating all the time. So, especially since COVID, we've got all these modern aids. We always had WhatsApp, but now we've got Teams, and we're always back and forth with each other. But you're right. There's that element of managing a team, or even like, I used to have younger kids who were working during the school holidays, be filling casks and that sort of thing. And they could be a real pain, but they were quite good fun. They would be playing music really loud, they'd be arguing, and half the time you'd despair with them, but you'd also, you kind of miss that. It's quite good fun. It's that human interaction.
Definitely, yeah. So, when we were actually discussing originally about you coming on this podcast, Andrew, I actually asked you a question. I said, how do you become a great brewer? So here we are. Why don't you tell me your answer to that question?
Yeah, so it's an answer that I think is really founded in my own experience as a brewer, both in the positive ways and the negative ways, and that's to form very close relationships with your suppliers. As a brewer, there were certainly times when I didn't want to see suppliers, and we can probably elaborate on that. But I also think during those times I learnt a lot from suppliers, and actually formed great friendships with some of them as well. So that's my kind of... That's the first thing I jump to with what it takes to become a great brewer, is that forming those relationships with your suppliers, because I think they help you a lot.
Totally agree. I think it was a really, really good answer. And actually, for the people who regularly listen to this podcast, you would have heard definitely in the CIP episode, in the Rub and Sniff episode, and in the last episode, how talking to your suppliers and maintaining a relationship helps you with each one of those individual sectors. But, I mean, Andrew, from a wide lens, why should you form relationships with your suppliers?
So I think I started writing a list of these things, and you'll have seen from a list that I started out with a slightly tongue-in-cheek, albeit still relevant, reasons to be close to suppliers. And the first that I wrote down was great merchandise. And I'm saying that coming from the company of Lallemand, which actually tends not to have great merchandise most of the time. We very recently started to do socks, which are very nice socks, but I think, we laugh, but it's actually something that brewers do value a lot of the time. And if you can provide merchandise that isn't bits of plastic that immediately get sent to landfill or recycled, why not? People like that sort of thing.
Used to be a borderline scrap in the production office when these things sort of came in. It
Yeah.
was like a royal rumble to who could get the right size and the right ones. I mean, actually, the niche of the company, the better the merch, is the way that I've always looked at it.
And there's some weird stuff out there. I always wanted to do, as a brewer, I always wanted a knife. That's always been vetoed by our marketing team because it might go wrong. I'm not really sure how it would go wrong. I think unless there's some sort of stabbing at a trade show. But I always thought a Lallemand knife would be nice. But yeah, you get some really interesting stuff out there. Belt buckles, rubber sheep. I think my boss has some rubber sheep in his office. I'm not sure where they came from.
I did have a hat that had Rub and Sniff written on it, which was quite a regrettable piece of merch to wear anywhere else outside the brewing industry. It's well dodged.
The second one I put in that list after great merch was dinner tickets, which again is slightly tongue in cheek. But if your supplier values your business and you value your supplier, then why not? There's some great brewing events out there which are good for you, the brewer, and also good for the supplier because they're meeting other brewers at those events. But you're meeting people, you're networking, you're learning things, and quite apart from anything else, you work hard in the brewing industry. It's nice to go for an ease up and let your hair down every now and then. So, I've been lucky enough to attend dinners as a customer. Of I think Murphy and Son took me somewhere, and I think Simpson's Malt took me somewhere, and I've taken people to these events as well, and they're great. I think there's definitely been some sort of in the past people have said it's a black tie. I don't really want to go to a black tie event, but I mean I'm on the committee of the southern section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, and we're trying to change that sort of mentality so it's a little less formal and a little more casual, but it's still got that kind of. I suppose special occasion type vibe to it. And they're great things to go to.
I uttered those exact words every time I was invited. I was like, I ain't wearing no black tie. Not my vibe.
Well, most of them now are dressed to impress or, wear what you like, that sort of thing, which I think, is probably a positive move. The brewing industry has probably a formal history, and certainly in the past it was always black tie and it was very proper and there was lots of kind of clapping and chanting and things like that. But things have moved on, and particularly the craft brewers aren't really keen on that sort of thing, so it's something that we're trying to change. So another one I mentioned was, and I think this people who listen to this, if they know me, they'll probably laugh because I've put down gossip.
I love this one.
And I think there are some people like that would probably describe me as a bit of a gossip. I probably wouldn't entirely agree, but because the suppliers go out and they go to all the breweries and they go to all the other suppliers, they learn things, and they, if you ever want to know something, then get a supplier's ear and say, well, what have you heard about this, and what have you heard about that, and you might learn a juicy piece of gossip, and I'm certainly not immune to that.
Maybe we should have a separate podcast series where we just blow the lid on some juicy gossip.
It has to be anonymous, though. You've given yourself
away. Okay, everyone, scrap what I just said. If one randomly appears, we have nothing to do with it. Okay.
Brewing gossip, yeah. Gosh, I mean, there's some good stories out there. There's always something that appears. You never guess what it is. Yeah. And then the final tongue-in-cheek one was actually job opportunities, which I suppose really isn't that tongue-in-cheek. I certainly, as you travel around breweries, you work with suppliers, you hear of positions that are going. And if you've been out and about and you know people, then you might think, oh, it'd be perfect, this position. Maybe I should suggest them. And there's nothing really to stop you doing so. If somebody gets approached about a job opportunity that they weren't expecting, or somebody approaches somebody who's looking for somebody, they're probably going to be quite pleased about it, really. And I personally have certainly recommended people for job roles that I know and like and think are very capable and would be good fits for those jobs that I've seen come up. So I think, those are very tangible benefits for the brewer. And I think certainly a job opportunity would be the case. But that's also good for the supplier, because I might recommend to another supplier that they try somebody, or they might recommend to me that somebody's suitable. So I think that's a very relevant point.
Yeah, I think it's a great, knowing your supplier is such a great gateway into the networking world. And I mean, going back to as you probably gathered from what I said before, when I was working in breweries, I was really disliked the idea of networking. in reflection, I can definitely say that's one of my biggest regrets, because if you ever want to maybe move out of production in brewing, your network is what you'll end up relying on to get that opportunity to go out. Or in my case now, when I'm like trying to start something new within the industry, having those people who have such strong networks, who are like festival names where they go in, people are like, oh, I know that person, they did this. Like, it really helps break down that barrier and helps you get out of production if that's what you want to do. Of course, it's not what everyone here wants to do, but it was one of my biggest regrets. So I can't go through this podcast without like rectifying that, like knowing your supplier and getting into these events and just going there and chatting to people is actually like really rewarding in the long run.
Absolutely, and I would probably attest to being in a similar position. I don't think I was that great at networking when I was a brewer, and it's actually it's not something we really speak about very often. But networking's actually a skill. Like it's
totally.
Some people come to it quite naturally, but it's absolutely a skill. Like, you have to make these connections. You have to remember people's names. That's quite hard. You probably, if you're really good at it, you probably write these things down and remember people and have like a little book.
Yeah, I still don't do that.
I don't do that, but I probably should.
Yes.
It is absolutely an important part of being a great brewer. Is having that connection, knowing the people to ask. I would probably like to be better at it than I am.
I think we all would, yeah. So we've talked about that sort of that human side. Is there anything like from a brewing technical perspective that you can get out from having your relationship with a supplier?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, as a brewer, you're sort of, especially in a smaller brewery, you're jack of all trades, right? You're not really specialised in any one part of the production process. As the brewery gets bigger, obviously that changes, and you might be specialising in packaging, yeast handling, purchasing, that sort of thing. But your suppliers, in general, will employ experts in their field at some point in the business. It might not necessarily be the guy that comes to your business and does the sales, but then again, it might be. And if you have questions about the products they're selling, or even about other products that you're using, they can be a great resource of technical information. When I go around breweries, yes, I work in yeast, but I wouldn't limit the things that I talk about or the knowledge that I give to only yeast. If somebody asks me for advice in any particular area of the brewing business, I'll happily provide it. And these people are well qualified, so that they might be master brewers. I've got a diploma in brewing, but they also, because they're out and about on the road, they see lots of different things. I think when you're in a brewery, you almost you get kind of pigeonholed into one way of thinking, because that's the way your particular brewery does it. But if you were to change job regularly, or you were to go into lots of different breweries, you'll see that they do things in different ways in different places. And suppliers can be great kind of bridges of knowledge between those different breweries, and they can help you see how to do things in different ways. They can help you with problems that you have. I genuinely think that as a technical resource, they're really, really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite awesome that as a brewer you have that capability to, especially if you have a good relationship with someone with your suppliers, you can just pick up that phone and be like, look, I'm having this problem, or I want to do this with my beer. What do you recommend, or what do you know from your experience? And even if you don't have to necessarily know that that's the right answer, but it's just having another opinion, or having someone with quite high levels of technical understanding, it's just so useful and powerful as an ally. And it's free advice. I mean, it should be taken all the time, in my opinion. I think there's often like maybe for some people a bit of like an ego barrier to break down, but as I said, it's just getting another opinion, and actually you'll find that they might have a product or something that will really help you just alleviate this massive problem or burden that you're carrying around.
Absolutely. I kind of see my job role really as a free consultant that happens to come along with advice that's based around yeast. It's what I do is I go around places and I say, okay, so what are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? How's that working for you? Maybe you could try it like this. And I might even be able to suggest products that that we sell that might help solve other people's problems. So I think that's another great reason to be near suppliers, just because they can suggest things that might actually help you, and they might even have something that's not on stock or still in development that might be something that you can try out. Whenever we launch a new product, be it a yeast or a process aid or a flavour enhancer, we always do trials with breweries before that gets anywhere near the market. We obviously have R&D in-house, and we do a lot of that too. But there's only so much that you can tell from trialing something in a lab. You have to try it in a real-world scenario, and that's a great thing to do with breweries that you have a good relationship with. You can say, okay, I've got this. It probably is going to be a product, but please try it and let me know what you think. You can really be at the forefront of new innovation by having good relationships with your suppliers.
Yeah, so what have been some of the successful product trials that you've done with some of your customers?
Oh, take it back to all sorts, really. I mean, we've when I started, I think we had about 9 yeasts maybe, and we keep releasing new ones. And some of them are more kind of, I guess, generic's the wrong word, but they're more widely available. So, like for instance, the verdant yeast, it's very flavourful, and it's got homologs out there in the industry, which other people might market as well. So I've done work with that, and certainly before that sort of strain was widely available in dried form, I did an awful lot of work with breweries to create beers that had ester profiles that you wouldn't find with other strains. And then more recently, we've started to do some quite unique stuff. So we're working with yeast breeding and creating yeast hybrids, which have basically been designed to have very specific criteria when we develop them. Does that make sense? I think it does.
Yeah.
So we're designing them to have very specific attributes in the brewery, and those are strains that you can't get anywhere else. But they address particular problems that breweries have. So most recently, we've come up with a hybrid lager yeast, which contains a greater proportion of ale yeast chromosomes compared with the wild eubionus ancestor of lager yeast, which means it can perform a bit more like an ale strain while retaining the lager flavour characteristics. And that's the sort of thing that can be really valuable to a brewery. So I've done lots of trials with that in breweries around the country, and they've been able to create lagers with shorter fermentation times and less diacetyl resting and that sort of thing. But we do stuff all the time. It might be products that already exist as well. So even simple things like doing findings optimizations or looking at fermentation times, that sort of thing. They're all things that we can help with.
Yeah, and yourself, and everyone listening knows how many problems fermentations can cause. And for a lot of brewers, maybe without some of the equipment, there can be a lot of unknowns. So having as much help and support on that, I think, really helps. But I really like the new product trials ideas, knowing your suppliers as well. I mean, they're quite powerful, and you can get ahead of the game a little bit. And if you wanted to create a competitive advantage, it's a fairly saturated market as we speak. So these are the types of ways you can do that, by having these new product trials and get lagers out, as you said, like easier and quicker and more consistently. So I think that's a really cool way of connecting with your supplier to get those. And it's not just yeast, you can get those from across all the industries, really.
Well, I think the guys that have done a really good job are the hop suppliers over the years, all these hops with the code names and the numbers, and everybody wants to know what that next new variety is going to be called once they get rid of the code name. I think they've done an absolutely brilliant job over the years of both using it as a marketing tool, but also a way of building relationships with brewers.
Yeah, I mean, £30 a kilo helps, right?
Yeah. I don't have a good finger on how much hops cost these days. I remember when I was buying hops, it was anywhere between about £9 a kilo and 35. But yeah, I wouldn't.
It's probably not too dissimilar, but probably on average much closer to 35 than 9, I would say.
Okay.
So where also can suppliers help with situations in the brewery?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about when you run into a very specific problem where your supplier can help. So the first one that I came up with, oh no, we've got no stock. We live in a complicated world, and something we've seen particularly over the last 3 years is interruptions to supply chains. And when you're in a brewery, you sometimes can't afford to have an interruption to your supply chain. You need that stock to be able to create products and put them out on the market. And in the occasion that your regular supplier might not be able to provide, obviously you want to stick with your regular supplier if you possibly could. But if there were a situation where that weren't possible, if you have good relationships with all the suppliers, if you've networked well, if you know these people, then maybe another supplier that supplies similar products might be able to deliver in the place of your current one at that particular time, and they can get you out of a bind. So that's one. If you have problems in supply, maybe they can help you there.
Definitely.
Yeah. One of the other ones is if you have problems with their products. So obviously, if you have problems with somebody's product, they're really going to want to know. So if you have a problem with their products, do let them know, and they're obviously going to do their very best to help and to find a way around that. They might send somebody in to check out the problem, they might investigate in their lab, but they're not going to say, we're not interested. They're always going to try and help you out with that. And probably along with that, if you have problems with other people's products, they're probably going to help you out with those as well. From a selfish perspective, if somebody's got problems with other people's products and they've exhausted the options that they have with that supplier and they come to you, that's not only a chance to help somebody, it's possibly a chance to create a new sale and a new relationship with a new customer. So they're always going to want to help you with the problems that you have, be it problems with their own products or problems with other people's.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I think a really good way that suppliers can help as well is actually, so I do a lot of work with environmental impact of breweries, and actually knowing your supplier and getting them to monitor their emissions, etc., is a really easy way of lowering your environmental impact, is by having a regular dialogue with suppliers of which product or which aspect they could use to help you with your environmental impact or reducing it. Exactly what you're saying with like the lager, I want to reduce the amount of time my lager spends cold or it spends in tank, then that you can also use them to help with that. I think that's quite a cool way. And a lot of suppliers are also now measuring their emissions, so you can just have a discussion with them and make decisions based on that. I think it's a pretty cool way of basically helping lower your emissions through suppliers.
Absolutely, and I think that focus on emissions is actually quite a new thing, and it will probably serve to solidify that relationship with brewers and suppliers even more, because you having to talk to your supplier about things that you wouldn't necessarily have ever mentioned before. It's becoming more and more important by the day that suppliers have answers to those questions. I think I remember the first time somebody even asked me that question, and it was probably only about 2 years ago, and now it's really current and it's really important.
Yeah, and it mainly because, as you said, I just echo, it's a lot easier to ask your suppliers what they're doing on emissions than looking at yourself. But it is also a really good way. 85% of your brewery's emissions are from the things that you buy. So by making better purchases, you can reduce your brewery's emissions. So it's cool that everyone's talking about it as well. Ultimately, that's the start of the action that we need, even if the action needs to happen a lot sooner rather than later. But at least the ball's rolling and people are really helping the environment, or our impact on the environment.
Yeah, and I think it's good as well for suppliers to communicate to brewers what they are doing behind the scenes, because it's probably quite a big project, right? If you've got dried yeast factories all around the world like we have, or you've got malting plant, like the amount of investment that needs to go on behind the scenes there is huge, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if you can communicate to your brewers what's going on, what you're doing, I think that gives them real assurance that something is happening behind the scenes, and you are doing something about it, and it will result in lowered emissions, albeit maybe not immediately, but definitely down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can brewers help manage the relationship with their supplier?
Yeah, so this is something that I spent a bit of time on, because it's certainly a situation that I've been in before when I was a brewer, and certainly a situation that I see now that I'm a supplier. And that's being open to meeting with suppliers. I mean, it's very easy to say when you're in a brewery environment that you're too busy, and often you are very busy. I certainly would be too busy to meet suppliers sometimes, and actually I think if I had made a bit more time to meet them, even though I was busy, it probably wouldn't have been a bad thing.
Yeah, totally.
My personal opinion on it is that the worst thing that you can come out with after a meeting with a supplier is that you've learnt nothing new. And the best thing is that you've learnt something that might help you in your day-to-day job. It might solve a problem that you have. You might even come away with a dinner ticket. So it's important to make time for your suppliers, but if you are too busy, say so, apologise, and try and make an appointment for another time.
Yeah, it's cool to look at it as a two-way street rather than, oh, they're supplying me, we're spending money with them. They're giving you a lot of information and they can give you a lot of technical support for effectively free or making a purchase you would already have to make. So trying to always look at supplier relationships like it's a two-way street. So you're equal peoples, I think.
Absolutely, and the other thing I think is it works both ways. So if you're a supplier and you've turned up and that brewer is obviously incredibly stressed out and very, very busy and probably too hot or too cold depending on the time of year, just say, look, I can see that you're busy, I'm going to leave you to it, but let's catch up later by email or something. I was in that situation earlier this summer where I think I'd been speaking to the brewery owner and he said, oh, I'm not around, but my head brewer is, so just go in and say hello. And I went in and this guy clearly hadn't been warned and was right in the middle of something and not keen to meet at all. And it's just about being perceptive, recognising that fact and saying, okay, this isn't time for this meeting, we need to move on. It might not have been an optimal use of your time, but it's better than trying to force yourself on somebody and not go away when clearly they're very, very busy.
Yeah, totally. Are there any more ways brewers can help manage the relationship?
So another one I had was not asking questions, not making complaints. Everybody recognises that in a supply industry things will occasionally go wrong. So you might have a problem with, I don't know, something gets damaged on the way to the brewer, there's a big hole in it, and there's malt pouring out the side, or something like that. And if you don't ask a question or make a complaint, and if those suppliers never receive questions or complaints, how are they ever to improve? So I would definitely recommend to any brewers that I speak that if they have problems with my products, that they contact me straight away. And I will do my very best to investigate. It might not be something that's anything to do with the product being wrong. It might be something that's happened in the brew house process. But then it could have been a problem at the supplier side, and whatever's happened, we'll do our best to investigate and try to rectify the problem for you. So I would always say, keep in touch. Don't be a stranger. If things are going wrong, just don't sit on your hands and stay silent. Get in contact with us. And the other counterpoint I had to that was try never to point the finger or do gotcha style interviews. So I've definitely had scenarios where I've been phoned up and the premise has not been to kind of work collaboratively to the bottom of a problem. It's been to try and say your use is causing me problems. It's your fault. And, that's. Maybe that's the case, but that's not the way I want to find out about it. I would like somebody to come to me first and say, I've got this problem, we think it could be the yeast. Do you think you could conduct a thorough investigation? And the answer there is never going to be no. It's always going to be yes, of course, we're going to look into this for you, because that's what a good supplier does. You don't just say it's not our problem. We're going to try and get to the bottom of it, ideally together.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just treating people with respect. Yeah, not pointing the finger and not doing those gotcha in things where you're like trying to trap people. You just wouldn't do that to anyone else, so you shouldn't do it to your supplier.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the final one was I put down ghosting. So everybody recognises that in a brewing environment that there are cost pressures, and while you might absolutely love your supplier, they might provide an excellent service, you're very happy with their products, there are cost pressures, and you might have to change supplier purely on the basis that you've been offered a better price or a similar service by somebody else. And if that's the case, be very upfront and open about it. Don't just stop buying from somebody else one day and blank and ghost your current supplier, because it just won't go down very well. I just wouldn't recommend it. It's much better to be open and frank about the situation and say, look, it's nothing personal. This is why we're changing supplier. This is who we're going to start to use. But please get in contact next year and try and bid for that business or quote for that business again, because it's not personal. And I think we as suppliers should recognise that. Obviously, every now and then you're going to be like, I really didn't want that to go that way, and you might want to take it a little bit personally, but it almost never is. So it's just about being upfront and honest with people,
Always. It's key to life. I would say not just managing relationships with suppliers, but managing all relationships is being upfront and honest is key. So what do you think are the hallmarks of a good supplier?
Again, it's that communication thing, really, isn't it? So it's about being open and frank with your customers. It's about responding, being there when you're needed, being open to question, to complaint, and to being able to help people. So if somebody has an issue, see if you can help out. I mean, that's one of the things I like best about my job is that it's essentially, a lot of the time, it's troubleshooting for somebody else. I mean, you're trying to diagnose technical brewing problems. And one of the nice things about it, speaking frankly, is you don't then have to be the person that implements it, which is often the hard thing in a brewery, right?
Yeah, totally.
It's not necessarily identifying the problem, it's implementing the solution, which is the hard bit. And as a supplier, I'm not necessarily the one that has to do that.
Yeah, it's so true.
So there's a lot of things, there's that, and then there's also delivering on time, providing high quality products, being innovative, coming out with new and interesting solutions, not resting on your laurels and just making the same thing over and over again. I think a good supplier, we like to think of ourselves as leaders in the yeast industry. So, we'll create new and interesting products and people might follow us, but that's where we want to be. We want to be that company that creates the exciting new yeast. And we don't really mind if somebody wants to come along and produce something similar, because we kind of see it as it's almost flattery, right? You want to be the guy that gets followed, because that's a mark of a good supplier.
Yeah, if I was to pick the number one of a hallmark of a good supplier outside the obvious delivering on time, I would say that's just like the hygiene factor. It's just the prerequisites of all good suppliers. But would definitely be like progressive suppliers, the ones who are pushing to better their processes and innovation within the industry, because as a brewer you might not have the ability to R&D on new yeast strains, but the companies do. So follow those ones and attach with the ones who are progressing the most, and also pushing. I mean, I'm going to repeat it because it is going to be one of the most important topics. But again, the ones who are reporting and pushing themselves in sustainability, I think that's completely within the R&D and progressive suppliers category, because it's the same thing. They're just pushing themselves in maybe a different way and trying to do what they're already doing, but more sustainable. As anyone who's doing that right now knows, it's a challenge, because you're kind of taking away a lot of the convenience of what you would normally be doing. So I think they're really good ways of identifying like a good supplier. And there are examples across all of our suppliers and each of the main ingredients and stuff of people who are not doing an amazing job on being progressive and kind of like not stuck in their ways, but doing the same thing they've always done. And there's some who are really pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And I think I think they're the ones who have always been the ones for me. I've always been like that's really exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, for me, coming from a scientific background, that the R&D side is just amazing. And it's looking at the scientific solutions for the problems that exist in the brewing industry. But I mean, in our case, not even just the brewing industry; it's solutions that exist across the wider Lallemand portfolio. I think one of my favourite examples is in the wine industry. Climate change is causing problems with grape harvests being essentially too sweet, so the Brix level in your grapes is too high. And one of the things that we've done to combat that is we've created a yeast. It's actually through laboratory evolution. So you grow a yeast. I think they do it in a very high salt content over thousands and thousands of generations, and over time that yeast adapts and actually starts to kick out glycerol as a stress factor. And in producing glycerol, it takes some of that carbon that came from the excessive sugar in the grapes, and instead of creating ethanol, which gives you too high an ethanol content in the final wine, it creates glycerol, and then therefore you end up with a lower alcohol content in that wine that you're producing. So I mean, it's just that sort of solution is just fascinating. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it is, and I remember I was actually at one of your talks, and you're talking about the new lager strain, and I texted my mate who's a brewer saying soon you won't have to even worry about fermentation temperature. These guys will just sort it out for you, because you're just like breeding in genes that basically means you don't have to look after this, you don't have to have as much attention to this. I'll say it's actually fascinating how suppliers are focusing on making the brewer's life easier And I think
Yeah.
that's really cool.
And it's technical innovation, isn't it? I remember I did a seminar on types of innovation, and one of the examples, I can't remember the specific type of innovation that it was, but it was an example of a corner in a footpath, and rather than walk around the corner, everybody just takes the diagonal across it, right? So rather than leaving that corner there, you just change the path so that the diagonal is there. And it's a similar kind of concept with yeast. You know, people have always got an end goal in mind, and if you can make that end goal easier to achieve, that's a very good way of doing innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really cool. One thing I would definitely add is maybe not on the hallmark of a good supplier, but I mean maybe just slightly track back to the, how can brewers manage relationships, is also like not becoming over reliant on one supplier. I think diversifying your portfolio of suppliers, whilst maybe slightly more time consuming in the short run, I think when there are supply shocks, when there are maybe disagreements, when there's something going on, having the ability to pull from one and maybe push back from the other a little bit, I think is really a good way. I think it's quite healthy business approach to supplier relationship as well, and it just means you get more support in general. And I do see often brewers quite over reliant, especially on, I'm not going to name, but on the company, but on one company they're just like using them like almost 100%. I'm like, there are other options out there, and it's really good to have a portfolio of suppliers, I think. You might disagree, agree. Andrew.
No, I would agree. Obviously, when you're talking about yeast, maybe it's a bit tricky because that's not necessarily the same strain across suppliers. But when I was a brewer, we diversified our hop supply, and that really helped iron out some of the shocks in supply that we saw. So particularly around harvest time, when we'd be running low on particular varieties, sometimes we'd find that the new variety that we wanted wasn't going to arrive for several months, and actually for that reason we brought on another supplier so that we would have, I guess, just continuity of supply. So we'd have something coming from one supplier, something coming from the other supplier. It was the same variety, but it just meant that we could still get it when we wanted it.
Yeah, and also if you're not picking lots, for example, sometimes you'll get something, maybe a batch or a lot code you're not specifically happy with, and it's great to have another one to balance that out with if it's not not great quality or not your favorite quality or not what you want out of it, and you can't really send it back or whatever, then it can be nice just to bounce those off. Definitely with hops, I think it's super important.
And you can blend away
absolutely right with yeast. Well, way more difficult to do that with the yeast, having a balance of suppliers. If you're having like one or two core yeast.
I found a good get out of jail free card there.
Absolutely. So Andrew, is there anything else you want to add or talk about in the pod?
Oh, I think there was a last point that I put down, and I think it's quite relevant, especially in the brewing industry, because the brewing industry is very friendly and open, and everybody knows each other, and we're just not the kind of people that you go to with a hard sell. So certainly as a brewer, my biggest pet peeve was with somebody that wanted to come in and hard sell to me, because it just wasn't something I responded to. By all means, come in and tell me about your products, tell me how great they are, tell me what you can provide, but don't say you have to buy this, you have to buy that, it's much cheaper than that supplier, but it's the same thing. That's just not what I would respond to well. I do remember I used to have somebody that come in almost on a monthly basis and try and sell me a second-hand centrifuge, and I feel like, I'm not uninterested in the centrifuge, But I don't want you to come in and try and sell me one every month. And I think the other problem there was that they hadn't actually identified the decision maker. I wasn't the guy that was going to say, yes, I'm going to spend 100k on a new centrifuge. So if you have a supplier who's going to come in and try and hard sell, and especially hard sell to the wrong person, that's just going to become annoying. So I would definitely encourage people not to go for the hard sell. It's not the way it works, really.
You actually really touched on something, Andrew, that I would like to add as well. Maybe you can disagree, but I think that when I was working in breweries and I was like not management level, I always felt that I couldn't really have that relationship with the supplier because I wasn't the purchaser. And I actually disagree with that now on reflection. I actually think that everyone should have this is kind of what I want to get across actually on this podcast. It's not really just for the decision makers and the brewery owners. I think having a relationship with your suppliers across all levels is really useful, because they can actually help you learn or get you resources. And again, that networking and job opportunities aspect that you talked about right at the start is actually the most useful when you're early on in your career. And I'm sure, I know you, Andrew, so I'm sure you'd be like super happy to have people talk to you who would and message you and stuff. Maybe not, even if they're not the decision maker or the purchaser, but they can still ask questions and see what's going on. I think that's a really nice way for someone to progress up the industry if they're looking to.
Oh, 100%. I suppose from a supplier's perspective of wanting to speak to the decision maker, there's really kind of two aspects to that. I mean, you can speak to the people that aren't the decision makers, and they'll learn a lot from you, and it will be great for their careers, and it will actually be good for you as a supplier, because you'll get to know them. It may help in terms of influencing those decision makers, but that really depends on the management structure of the brewery that you're visiting, right? So, in my personal opinion, nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. Exactly. You might be the decision maker in that brewery, but it doesn't mean to say the person who's not long finished their general certificate in brewing or come out with a Harriet Watt degree doesn't have an entirely relevant and good idea that might do great things for your brewery. Where I think sometimes that gets complicated is in if you have management structures that don't have that level of openness between them. So if your decision maker isn't talking to or isn't listening to those people at the lower levels of the business, that can be, I actually think that would be a real problem,
Yes.
Because those people do have good ideas. Yeah.
And if anyone wants to know more about that, there's a podcast on when you should leave your job, and spoiler alert, that might come up as a reason to leave. Is when you're not working in progressive structures who are allowing you to like grow and develop as a brewer and as a person. And it's exactly, and I know exactly what you mean. It's for maybe some people listen to this are thinking, well, I've never experienced that, and some people are thinking, well, that's exactly what I'm experiencing right now. It really is quite brewery specific of whether that happens, but yeah, if your management structure is not allowing you to speak to your suppliers, then I would say that's a good reason to.
Yeah, I do, and I've personally been there, so I can fully understand that it's frustrating, demoralising, and nobody really wants to be in that situation.
Absolutely.
So if you can change the culture within the business, great. But if you can't, well. Maybe it's too frank. I'd be off.
Yep, that's exactly what we talk about in that podcast, man. I was like, don't wait around. Don't wait around. Just if it's not working and you're not getting what you need out of it to progress. Like, yeah, that was yeah. Should listen to that episode, man. That was pretty good.
Yeah, I will do actually.
All right, Andrew. So I think that's covered everything. I'm really happy with that, and I think that anyone who's listening would now feel comfortable and know how to get the most out of their relationships with their suppliers, and hopefully bridge maybe some gaps in knowledge, or maybe trial new products to progress their brewery and piggyback off some of the R&D that you guys are doing at Lallemand and at other places, and implement that in their brewery before everyone else. I think that's such a cool way of R&D within your own brewery. So yeah, I think we covered a lot. I thought it was really exciting for the people listening. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. It's been fun.
Awesome, dude. Well, I'll catch you around because we're always knocking around at the same events. So I'll catch you soon, mate.
Absolutely. Probably, yeah, Brewers Congress, I think. That might be the next time.
That'll be the next one. That's the big one.
Looking forward to it.
Awesome, man. Well, I'll catch you then. And thanks again for coming on.
No problem at all. Cheers.
Brilliant. Another big thank you to Andrew. What a great guest. And the guy knows so much. I think it's such a cool message. It's something again, as I said, we touched on in so many other pods, but actually when he said it to me, know your suppliers, I was like, absolutely love that. So I'm so glad we got the time to do that. So the next episode's coming out in a couple of weeks. In case you don't want to miss it, please hit the subscribe or follow button, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Modern Brewer